The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of a busy day as passengers hurried to their gates, rolling suitcases clicking rhythmically across the tiled floors. Among the crowd was Jordan, a quiet and reserved man in his early 30s. Dressed sharply in a navy blazer, his kind eyes scanned his boarding pass one last time before heading to his assigned gate. It was a routine flight for him, a work trip that he'd taken many times before. He never expected this particular journey to be anything other than ordinary. The gate area was crowded, filled with a mix of anxious flyers, families wrangling small children, and business travelers like Jordan, glued to their phones or laptops. The faint voice of the gate agent announcing the boarding process echoed through the terminal, pulling everyone's attention toward the gate. Jordan stood in line patiently, clutching his boarding pass and a small carry-on bag. He was seated in first class today, a rare treat, courtesy of his company's travel policy. As the line moved forward, Jordan smiled politely at the flight attendants greeting passengers at the aircraft door. His seat was near the front, so he quickly found his row and placed his carry-on in the overhead bin. Settling into the plush first-class seat, he exhaled softly, ready for a few hours of peace before his busy work schedule resumed. Moments later, another passenger appeared in the aisle, looking down at Jordan's seat with a furrowed brow. She was older, maybe in her late 40s, and her posture radiated authority. She wore a crisp uniform, the telltale attire of a flight attendant. Her name tag read, Ms. Connolly. Without even greeting him, she pointed to his seat and said in a sharp, dismissive tone, "Sir, you're in the wrong seat. Please check your boarding pass." Jordan blinked, caught off guard by the abruptness. He reached for his pocket, pulling out the boarding pass. "This is 3A, right?" he asked politely, his tone calm and measured. Ms. Connolly barely glanced at the slip of paper in his hand. "This seat is reserved for first-class passengers," she snapped, her voice louder now, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Jordan's stomach tightened. The tension in her voice was unmistakable, and the stares from the other passengers felt heavy. Keeping his composure, he responded, "Yes, I'm in first class. This is my assigned seat." Ms. Connolly crossed her arms and glared at him. "Sir, I'm not going to argue. This seat belongs to someone else. You need to move to the back of the plane." Her tone was icy, the kind of voice that left no room for discussion, or so she thought. By now, passengers nearby were murmuring to each other, their curious eyes bouncing between Jordan and the flight attendant. A man in the adjacent row adjusted his glasses, clearly uneasy with what he was witnessing. Jordan felt his heart race, not out of anger, but out of disbelief. He couldn't understand why she was so insistent or why her demeanor was so unnecessarily harsh. He tried once more to explain, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, there must be some misunderstanding. This is my seat. It's clearly printed on my boarding pass." But Ms. Connolly wasn't having it. Her face flushed with irritation as she leaned closer, her voice dripping with condescension. "Listen, I've worked this job long enough to know when someone's trying to pull a fast one. You don't belong here, so either you move or I'll have security escort you off this plane." The words hit Jordan like a cold slap. The implication behind her tone was painfully clear, even if she didn't say it outright. He glanced around the cabin, catching the uneasy gazes of other passengers. Some looked sympathetic, while others seemed to be avoiding eye contact altogether, as if pretending not to notice would erase the tension. Jordan took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't about to let this escalate into a scene, but he also wasn't going to let himself be disrespected. Before he could respond, a voice from the back of the first-class cabin cut through the air like a knife. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" All heads turned toward the speaker. It was another flight attendant, a younger woman with a professional yet approachable demeanor. Her name tag read, Sarah. She walked down the aisle, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. Ms. Connolly straightened up, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "This gentleman is in the wrong seat," she said curtly. Sarah frowned and looked at Jordan, who held out his boarding pass. She took it, her eyes scanning the details. Then she glanced back at Ms. Connolly, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Ms. Connolly," Sarah said carefully, her voice low but firm, "this is his assigned seat." A hush fell over the cabin. Miss Connolly's face turned an even deeper shade of red as she sputtered, "There must be a mistake." But Sarah cut her off. "The only mistake I see is how you've handled this situation." Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Jordan stayed silent, watching the exchange unfold. He didn't want to say anything that might worsen the situation, but he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had his back. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ms. Connolly opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the captain emerged from the cockpit. His presence immediately commanded attention. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. Sarah quickly filled him in, sparing no details about what had just transpired. As she spoke, the captain's expression hardened. His eyes flicked toward Ms. Connolly, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. Passengers held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The air crackled with suspense, the kind that made time feel like it was standing still. And then, in a moment that no one could have predicted, the captain turned to Ms. Connolly and said 6 words that sent shockwaves through the cabin. "We need to talk. Now." The cabin remained eerily quiet as Ms. Connolly followed the captain toward the front of the plane. Her rigid posture and stiff gait betrayed her unease. The murmurs among passengers grew louder, a mix of curiosity and discomfort rippling through the cabin like an undercurrent. Jordan sat in his seat, trying to process what had just unfolded. While he was relieved that someone had stepped in, he couldn't shake the lingering tension in the air. Sarah, the younger flight attendant, leaned down toward him, her voice soft and reassuring. "I'm so sorry about that, sir. Please let me know if you need anything at all." Her warm smile contrasted starkly with the icy demeanor of her colleague moments earlier. Jordan nodded, offering a polite thank you, but his mind was racing. He wasn't the type to draw attention to himself, and he certainly hadn't expected this kind of confrontation. It wasn't just the embarrassment that stung, it was the way Ms. Connolly had spoken to him, her words laced with an unspoken prejudice that felt all too familiar. He had experienced subtle moments like this before, but never in such a public and blatant way. As Sarah walked away to assist another passenger, Jordan glanced out the window, hoping to steady his nerves. The faint hum of the engines preparing for takeoff was almost soothing, yet the memory of Ms. Connolly's harsh tone replayed in his mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the captain and Ms. Connolly stood near the galley out of earshot of the passengers. The captain's voice was low but firm, his displeasure evident in his clipped sentences. Miss Connolly, flustered and defensive, tried to explain herself, but her words only seemed to dig her into a deeper hole. "Captain, I just thought there was a mistake," she began, her voice trembling slightly. The captain interrupted, his tone unwavering. "You don't treat passengers that way, especially when they've done nothing wrong. This isn't the first time I've had complaints about your behavior, Miss Connolly. I won't tolerate this kind of conduct on my flight." Her face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the captain's stern expression left no room for debate. Back in the cabin, Jordan noticed the man sitting across the aisle from him, leaning in slightly. He looked to be in his mid-40s, wearing a tailored suit and glasses. His expression was one of quiet concern. "Hey," the man said in a low voice, careful not to draw too much attention. "Are you okay?" Jordan nodded, appreciating the gesture. "Yeah, I'm fine." Just surprised, I guess." The man frowned. "That wasn't right, the way she spoke to you. I saw the whole thing, and you handled it better than most people would have." Jordan gave a small smile. "Thanks. I'm just glad someone stepped in before it got worse." The man introduced himself as Daniel, a frequent flyer who'd seen his fair share of tense moments on planes, but nothing quite like this. As they chatted quietly, Jordan felt a sense of camaraderie. It was comforting to know that at least one other person understood the gravity of what had just happened. Elsewhere in the cabin, other passengers exchanged whispers, their eyes darting toward the front of the plane where Ms. Connolly and the captain remained out of sight. Some were visibly uneasy, while others seemed more annoyed by the delay than the incident itself. A few rows back, a young woman with a laptop open in front of her began typing furiously. She was a blogger, always on the lookout for interesting stories, and this one was unfolding right before her eyes. Her fingers danced across the keyboard as she documented every detail, already imagining the headline she would write later. "Flight attendant confronts passenger over seat mix-up." What happened next will shock you. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the cabin refused to dissipate. It was as though everyone was waiting for something, anything, to happen next. The captain eventually returned to the cockpit, his expression unreadable. Ms. Connolly reappeared shortly after, her face pale and her steps hesitant. She avoided eye contact with everyone as she made her way down the aisle. When she reached Jordan's row, she paused briefly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir," she said stiffly, her voice devoid of its earlier harshness, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Jordan looked up at her, studying her face. The apology felt forced, but he decided not to push the issue. He simply nodded and said, "Thank you." Ms. Connolly moved on quickly, her presence still leaving a ripple of unease in her wake. Sarah, watching from the back of the cabin, exchanged a glance with another crew member. It was clear that the situation wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. As the plane finally began to taxi toward the runway, Jordan tried to relax, but his mind kept circling back to what had happened. Why had Ms. Connolly been so quick to assume he didn't belong in first class? Was it really just a misunderstanding, or was there something deeper at play? His thoughts were interrupted by Sarah, who returned to check on him. She knelt slightly, so she was at eye level, her expression kind but serious. "If you need to file a formal complaint, I'd be happy to assist you once we're in the air," she offered. Jordan hesitated. He wasn't the type to make waves, but something about this felt too important to let slide. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Sarah nodded, her understanding clear. "Just let me know." As the plane took off, Jordan stared out the window, the city below growing smaller and smaller. He couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was going to be more eventful than anyone had anticipated. Unbeknownst to him, Sarah wasn't the only one planning to take action. Several passengers had already started discussing the incident among themselves, and a few were determined to ensure that Jordan received the respect he deserved. In the quiet hum of the cabin, alliances were forming, and the seeds of change were being sown. What had started as an uncomfortable encounter was beginning to take on a life of its own, and no one, not even Ms. Connolly, could predict where it would lead next. As the plane leveled out in the sky, the hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the atmosphere remained far from calm. Jordan leaned back in his seat, glancing around discreetly. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, passengers who had witnessed the incident earlier, some stealing glances while others openly observed him. He tried to focus on the in-flight magazine in his lap, but the words blurred as his thoughts churned. Across the aisle, Daniel, who had introduced himself earlier, tapped lightly on the armrest to get Jordan's attention. "You know, you handled that better than I would have," he said in a low voice. I've seen people lose their cool over less, but you kept it together." Jordan gave him a faint smile. "Thanks. Honestly, I didn't know what else to do. She was just so convinced I didn't belong here." Daniel adjusted his glasses, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been flying for years and I've seen stuff like this before. It's subtle sometimes, but other times, like today, it's not. People make assumptions and it's not fair." Jordan nodded, grateful for the validation. "It's frustrating, but I've learned to pick my battles. I don't want to be the guy who causes a scene, you know." Daniel leaned back in his seat, his brows furrowed. "Still, it's not something you should have to deal with. And honestly, I think more people notice than you realize. You're not alone in this." Meanwhile, a few rows back, the young blogger with the laptop was deep into her own thoughts. She had witnessed the entire interaction and couldn't shake the discomfort it left her with. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, debating whether to share what she had seen in real time. She opened a draft post, typing and deleting sentences, trying to strike the right balance between calling out the injustice and ensuring she didn't escalate the situation unnecessarily. In the back of the plane, Sarah stood near the galley, quietly speaking with another flight attendant. Her voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to her tone that hinted at her frustration. "This isn't the first time Ms. Connolly's acted like this," Sarah said, shaking her head. "I've worked with her before, and she has a habit of singling people out. I'm not sure what her issue is, but it's not okay." The other attendant, an older man named Greg, sighed. "I've heard the complaints too, but she's been with the airline for years. Management's always been hesitant to do anything." "About her?" Sarah crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "Well, they're going to have to address it this time. That passenger didn't deserve to be treated like that, and I'm not going to let it slide." Greg raised an eyebrow. You planning to report her?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, someone has to. It's not just about what happened today. It's about preventing this from happening again. We have a responsibility to make sure every passenger feels respected and safe." Back in the cabin, Ms. Connolly moved through the aisles, her usual, confidence replaced by a stiff, almost robotic demeanor. She avoided eye contact with passengers and kept her interactions short, her voice lacking its earlier sharpness. But despite her efforts to act as though nothing had happened, the tension in her posture was impossible to miss. As she passed by Jordan's row, he couldn't help but notice how her gaze flickered toward him briefly before darting away. He wondered what the captain had said to her during their conversation. Did she feel any regret? Or was she just trying to save face? The minutes dragged on, and Jordan decided to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but even that didn't provide much relief. His thoughts kept returning to the incident, replaying the way Ms. Connolly's voice had cut through the cabin, how she had dismissed him without even giving his explanation a chance. Across the aisle, Daniel leaned over again, this time lowering his voice even further. "You know," he said, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening, "if you decide to file a complaint, I'd be happy to back you up. I saw the whole thing, and I think it's important someone speaks up about it." Jordan looked at him, surprised by the offer. "I appreciate that," he said sincerely. "I haven't decided yet, but it's good to know someone else noticed." Daniel nodded, his expression resolute. "It's not just about you. It's about setting an example. If people like her think they can get away with treating others like that, they'll keep doing it. Sometimes the only way things change is when people like us speak up." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah, who returned to Jordan's row with a tray of drinks. She set a glass of water on his tray table, her smile warm and genuine. "Here you go," she said softly. Then, leaning in slightly, she added, "If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm here to make sure you're comfortable." Jordan thanked her, sensing that her words carried more weight than they appeared to on the surface. She wasn't just doing her job, she was making it clear that she supported him. As Sarah walked away, Jordan felt a small sense of relief. For the first time since boarding the plane, he felt like he wasn't entirely alone in this. However, the undercurrent of tension remained. Passengers continued to exchange glances, their whispers growing louder as the flight progressed. Some seemed genuinely concerned, while others appeared more interested in the drama unfolding around them. In first class, where appearances were often everything, the air felt heavier than usual. It was as though everyone was waiting for the next spark to ignite what was already a smouldering fire, and at the heart of it all, Jordan couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the plane landed. Would this all blow over? Just another uncomfortable memory to add to the pile? Or was this the beginning of something much bigger? Something that would force people to confront the uncomfortable truths that often went unspoken. As the plane continued its journey, the answers remained elusive, and the tension lingered, like the calm before a storm that everyone could sense but no one could predict. As the plane cruised through the sky, the cabin seemed quieter than usual, though it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of stillness that comes with tension, where every movement and sound felt amplified. Jordan could sense it in the way passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting toward the front of the plane whenever Ms. Connolly passed by. She was making every effort to appear composed, her posture upright and her expression neutral. But the cracks in her demeanor were beginning to show. Her movements were slightly rushed, her hands fidgeting with the edges of her uniform, and, every so often, her gaze would flicker nervously toward the cockpit. It was clear that the earlier confrontation with the captain had rattled her, but it didn't seem like she fully grasped the gravity of the situation, or maybe she was just hoping it would all blow over. Jordan tried to keep to himself, but the weight of what had happened still sat heavily on his chest. He thought back to Daniel's offer to support him if he decided to file a complaint. It was tempting, but a small part of him hesitated. Would anything actually change? Would speaking up make a difference? Or would it just make him the subject of more scrutiny? As he mulled it over, Sarah walked by again, this time stopping briefly at his row. She crouched slightly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Just so you know, I've already submitted a report to the captain. What happened earlier isn't something we take lightly." Jordan looked at her, a mix of gratitude and surprise in his expression. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I did," Sarah replied firmly. "It's my job to make sure everyone feels safe and respected, and that includes standing up when something isn't right. You deserve better than what happened back there." Her words settled over, him both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it was clear she genuinely cared, and unsettling because they hinted at consequences that had yet to unfold. As Sarah walked away, Jordan glanced over at Daniel, who raised an eyebrow as if to say, "See, you're not alone in this." It was a small gesture, but it gave Jordan a flicker of reassurance. The hours passed slowly, each minute dragging as the tension in the cabin seemed to thicken. Every time Ms. Connolly walked down the aisle, the whispers among passengers grew louder. Some spoke in hushed tones, recounting the incident to those who hadn't seen it, while others speculated about what might happen next. A few rows back, the young blogger had finally decided to document the situation, though she kept her words measured. She typed a brief description of what had happened, careful not to include any identifying details about Jordan. Instead, she focused on the broader issue, hinting at the importance of addressing bias and ensuring fair treatment for everyone. She saved the draft, but didn't hit publish just yet, wanting to see how the rest of the flight played out. Meanwhile, in the galley, Sarah and Greg exchanged a few quiet words. "The captain's planning to file a formal report once we land," Greg said, his voice low. "It sounds like Ms. Connolly's days with the airline might be numbered." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. Good. This isn't the first time she's crossed the line, but it needs to be the last. Passengers deserve better, and so do we. Greg sighed, leaning against the counter. I just hope it doesn't escalate before we land. The way she's been acting, it's like she's trying to hold it together, but I don't think she's handling just around the corner, out of sight, but close enough to hear their conversation. Her hands clenched into fists as their words echoed in her mind. She felt trapped, the walls closing in around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was against her, and the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Back in the cabin, the tension was nearing a breaking point. Passengers who had initially tried to stay out of the situation were now openly discussing it. Some were sympathetic toward Jordan, while others seemed more interested in the spectacle itself. As the flight attendants began preparing for the descent, Jordan noticed Ms. Connolly lingering near the front of the cabin, her gaze sweeping over the passengers. Her expression was hard to read, somewhere between defiance and desperation. She was clearly aware of the attention she was getting, and it seemed to fuel her growing unease. Jordan shifted in his seat, trying to shake off the nagging feeling that something was about to happen. He glanced at Daniel, who gave him a reassuring nod, but even Daniel seemed more on edge than before. When Ms. Connolly finally began making her way down the aisle, her steps were slower, her eyes meeting those of the passengers who had been whispering about her. She stopped abruptly near Jordan's row, her gaze locking on him for just a moment, before she turned and walked toward the galley. Jordan's heart raced, though he wasn't sure why. The way she had looked at him, it wasn't quite anger, but it wasn't an apology either. It was almost as if she was daring him to do something, though he couldn't imagine what. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to the destination. The usual chatter about weather and arrival times felt oddly out of place, given the tension still lingering in the air. Passengers began adjusting their seats and gathering their belongings, but the atmosphere remained thick with unspoken conflict. It was clear that the situation hadn't reached its conclusion, and everyone, Jordan included, was bracing for whatever came next. As the plane neared the runway, Jordan couldn't shake the feeling that the real turbulence hadn't even begun yet. Whatever was coming, it was just around the corner, waiting to unfold in ways no one could predict. As the plane touched down and the familiar thud of the landing gear echoed through the cabin, Jordan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The flight was almost over, but the tension that had been brewing didn't dissipate. If anything, it felt like it had shifted into something even heavier, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. Passengers around him began gathering their belongings, the usual murmurs of travel filling the air. But beneath the surface, an unspoken awareness lingered. People weren't just getting ready to disembark, they were waiting, watching to see what would happen next. Jordan felt it too, that strange mix of anticipation and dread. He tried to focus on the simple task of retrieving his carry-on, but his thoughts kept circling back to Ms. Connolly. She stood at the front of the plane, her expression unreadable as she directed passengers. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, like someone trying to maintain control in a situation that was slipping through their fingers. Jordan couldn't help but notice how she avoided making eye contact with him, her gaze fixed just above the rows of seats as though she were looking straight past everyone. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed more focused than ever. As she moved through the cabin, assisting passengers and offering polite goodbyes, her eyes flickered toward Miss Connolly every so often, as if she were keeping a silent watch. It was subtle, but Jordan caught it. There was a quiet determination in her demeanor, a readiness to step in if needed. The plane slowed to a stop at the gate, and the seatbelt signs dinged off. Passengers rose from their seats, the shuffle of bags and coats filling the air. Jordan stood, waiting his turn to step into the aisle. As he did, he noticed Daniel lingering nearby, his expression thoughtful. "Something tells me this isn't over," Daniel said under his breath, glancing toward the front of the plane. Jordan nodded, feeling the same unease. "Yeah, I've got the same feeling." As the line of passengers slowly moved forward, Jordan couldn't shake the tension building in his chest. He was just a few rows from the exit when a voice broke through the low hum of conversation. "Excuse me, ma'am," a man said loudly, his tone firm but not aggressive. Jordan turned toward the sound and saw a passenger standing a few rows behind him, his arm raised slightly to get Ms. Connolly's attention. "I couldn't help but notice something earlier during the flight. I think it needs to be addressed." The cabin went quiet almost instantly, the shuffle of bags and movement halting as heads turned toward the man. Ms. Connolly froze, her composed facade cracking. "Ever so slightly. Sir, if you have a concern, I'd be happy to address it after everyone has deplaned," she said, her voice steady but with an edge of nervousness. "I think it's something everyone should hear," the man replied, his tone unwavering. "What I saw wasn't just a minor issue. It was disrespectful and unprofessional, and I'm not going to stay quiet about it." Jordan's heart raced as he realized the man was referring to the earlier confrontation. His mind raced. Was this going to escalate further? Should he say something? Before he could react, another voice joined in, this time from a woman seated a few rows ahead. "I saw it too," she said firmly. "That passenger didn't deserve to be treated like that. It wasn't right." The murmurs that followed were no longer quiet whispers. Passengers began speaking up, their voices overlapping, as more and more people voiced their agreement. Some shared what they had seen, while others simply expressed their disapproval of what had happened. Ms. Connolly's face turned pale, her usual confidence replaced by a visible unease. She opened her mouth to respond, but the word seemed to catch in her throat. For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken, her eyes darting around the cabin as if searching for an escape. The captain stepped out of the cockpit, his expression calm but commanding. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. Sarah stepped forward quickly, her tone measured but firm. "Captain, I believe the passengers are addressing an incident that occurred earlier. I've already submitted a report about it, but it seems it's become a larger concern." The captain's gaze shifted to Ms. Connolly, who stood frozen at the front of the plane. "Ms. Connolly," he said evenly, "perhaps you should join me in the jet bridge. For a moment, we need to discuss this further." The tension in the cabin reached a boiling point as Ms. Connolly hesitated, her eyes darting from the captain to the passengers and back again. It was clear she didn't want to leave, as though doing so would mean admitting fault. But under the weight of the captain's steady gaze and the growing murmur of the passengers, she finally relented. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the captain followed, leaving the cabin in an uneasy silence. Passengers exchanged looks, some visibly relieved, while others seemed to be bracing for what might happen next. Jordan stayed quiet, his thoughts racing. The passenger's willingness to speak up had caught him off guard, and for the first time he felt a flicker of hope that things might actually change. But he also knew this wasn't the end. Whatever was happening in the jet bridge would determine what came next, and the tension in the cabin made it clear that everyone else was waiting to see how it would unfold too. As the line of passengers began moving again, Jordan stepped closer to the exit. The weight of the day's events hung over him, but he knew the story wasn't over yet. There was still more to come, and he could feel it in the air, an unshakable sense that the truth was about to come to light in a way no one had anticipated. The cabin buzzed with anticipation as passengers shuffled off the plane one by one, the earlier murmurs giving way to a tense silence. Jordan lingered near the exit, not out of hesitation, but because he felt the weight of unfinished business pressing on his chest. He glanced toward the jet bridge, where Miss Connolly and the captain had disappeared moments earlier. Though the door remained closed, the tension spilling from it felt almost palpable. Daniel stayed close by, his expression thoughtful but subdued. "Looks like they're handling it," he said quietly, nodding toward the bridge. Jordan gave a slight nod, unsure of what handling it even meant in a situation like this. Would there be accountability, or would everything be swept under the rug once they were out of sight? The uncertainty gnawed at him. As he reached the threshold of the exit, Sarah appeared, her expression calm, but with a flicker of determination in her eyes. "Jordan," she said softly, catching his attention, "I think you should wait a moment. The captain may want to speak with you." Jordan hesitated, caught between wanting to move on and feeling an obligation to see this through. Before he could respond, the jet bridge door opened, and the captain stepped back into the cabin, his face composed but stern. Behind him, Miss Connolly followed, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. The captain addressed the passengers, still within earshot. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption earlier in this flight. We take these matters very seriously, and I assure you they are being addressed appropriately." His voice was firm, with just enough authority to silence any lingering whispers. Jordan stood frozen, unsure whether to stay or leave. But then the captain turned his attention directly to him, stepping closer with a quiet but purposeful stride. "Mr. Davis," he said, his voice softer now but no less serious, "would you mind stepping aside for a moment? I'd like to have a word." Jordan's pulse quickened as he nodded and followed the captain toward the corner of the gate area, away from the stream of departing passengers. Sarah joined them, standing just behind the captain as he began speaking. "I want to personally apologize for the treatment you experienced on this flight," the captain said, his tone earnest. "It was unacceptable, and I want you to know that we're taking immediate action to address it." Jordan shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. He appreciated the apology, but words alone didn't feel like enough. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else," he said finally, his voice steady but edged with emotion. "And it won't," the captain assured him. "Ms. Connolly's behavior today has been reported and documented. She's been removed from duty effective immediately, pending a full investigation. This is not the kind of conduct we tolerate at our airline." The words hit Jordan harder than he expected, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over him. He glanced at Ms. Connolly, who stood nearby, her face pale and her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked as though she wanted to speak, but the weight of the situation and the eyes of those around her kept her silent. But just as Jordan was about to thank the captain, a voice called out from behind them, "Excuse me, but there's something else you might want to know." Jordan turned to see the young blogger, her phone in hand and a determined look on her face. She stepped forward, addressing the captain directly. "I didn't want to say anything before because I wasn't sure it mattered, but I caught part of what happened on video, and there's something on here you might want to see." The tension in the air spiked as the captain gestured for her to continue. She hesitated for only a moment before playing the clip, the audio clear despite the hum of background noise. It showed Ms. Connolly addressing Jordan, her tone sharp and dismissive. But what stood out wasn't just her words. It was the way. She glanced toward another passenger seated nearby and muttered something under her breath. The clip ended, and the captain's expression darkened. "What did she say there?" he asked, his tone low but firm. The blogger hesitated, then looked directly at Jordan. She said, "I'm not wasting time on someone like him." A collective silence fell over the group as the weight of those words settled in. Jordan's chest tightened, the sting of the remark hitting him anew. It wasn't just about the seat assignment or her tone. It was about something deeper, something uglier that had finally come to light. The captain straightened, his gaze hardening as he turned back to Ms. Connolly. "Do you deny saying that?" Ms. Connolly's face flushed, her composure crumbling. "It was taken out of context," she said quickly, her voice defensive. "I was frustrated." "It doesn't matter what context you think justifies it," the captain interrupted, his tone sharp. "That kind of behavior is unacceptable, and it reflects poorly on you and this airline." The finality of his words seemed to drain the fight out of Ms. Connolly. She stood there, silent and defeated, as the captain turned back to Jordan. "Again, I'm deeply sorry for what happened today. You've shown incredible patience and grace in a situation where many wouldn't. I hope you'll allow us to make this right moving forward." Jordan nodded, his emotions a mix of exhaustion and relief. "Thank you," he said quietly, knowing it was all he could say in the moment. As the group began to disperse, Jordan felt Daniel clap a hand on his shoulder. "Looks like justice was served," Daniel said with a small smile. Jordan managed a faint smile in return, but as they walked away, he couldn't shake the lingering thought in his mind. The incident was over, but the broader issue it represented wasn't. It was a reminder of how much work still needed to be done, not just on flights, but everywhere. Just as they reached the baggage claim, Daniel nudged him, nodding toward a news alert on his phone. The headline read, "Passenger Incident Highlights Need for Change in Airline Policies." Jordan exhaled slowly. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger.